just about every other developed country in the world, apart from Trump's America, is taking a very different approach.
Malcolm Turnbull's toppling 2 years ago only confirmed that the coalition party room is allergic to market mechanisms to deal with carbon emissions. That's left massive market intervention as the only other option left. There are elements Labor might support, but whether this plan can last longer than any before it is very uncertain. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, as the energy debate continues here, Britain's Prince Charles says climate change poses such a severe threat that the world's only option is to adopt a military-style response. His call comes as scientists report that warming in the Arctic has shrunk sea ice to record low levels. At the UN General Assembly, leaders called on member states to keep their promises made in the Paris Agreement. Here's Yvonne Yong.
Satellites have recorded this year's sea ice minimum at 3.74 million square kilometres, only the second time it's measured below 4 million square kilometres in 40 years of record keeping.
The Arctic sea ice has reached its minimum extent today, and this year, yet again, it's a near record low.
According to longtime advocate for nature, Prince Charles, it's one of many examples of why urgent action is needed on climate change.
It is now rapidly becoming a comprehensive catastrophe that will dwarf the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. At this late stage, I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people and planet. We must now put ourselves on a warlike footing.
Prince Charles is referring to action reminiscent of the US Marshall Plan to rebuild post-war Europe. Scientists are urging governments to wean the global economy off fossil fuels and protect and restore forests, wetlands and other ecosystems. The president of the Marshall Islands, a low-lying atoll nation threatened by rising sea levels, has called on member states at the UN General Assembly to do their part for the planet.
All countries, in particular, large emitters, must come forward to keep their promises made in the Paris Agreement.
Prince Charles, in his statement, referred to emergencies such as the Pantanal in Brazil being consumed by unprecedented numbers of fires. But President Jair Bolsonaro instead suggests they should be congratulated for environmental preservation.
We are an example for the world.
That's despite figures showing deforestation in the much greater Amazon have jumped by at least a third compared to a year ago. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
The Victorian Premier says the state is on track to take the next step out of lockdown next week, even though today's numbers have jumped back up. There were 28 new cases today, more than double yesterday's tally, but sadly 3 more Victorians with COVID have died. All of those are linked to aged care. Here's Nicole Asher.
This is one of dozens of aged care centres currently dealing with an outbreak of COVID-19. All of the Victorians who died overnight were in aged care.
We send, of course, our deepest sympathies and condolences to those 3 families.
24 of the latest cases are also linked to known nursing home outbreaks.
Some are residents, some are staff, and actually some might be household members of staff members.
While we could think about it as a health environment, it's a residential environment. It's a place that's people's home, and so it's going to be more difficult to control the spread of infection than in hospitals and other clinical settings.
The aged care clusters are spread across Melbourne, but this facility in Melton South has the most active infections. It's followed by Estia in Keilor. 2 other facilities have 29. Bapt Care in Werribee, which has had more than 250 confirmed infections, has 23 active cases. The majority of infections have occurred in private aged care homes, which are regulated by the Commonwealth. Some of the largest outbreaks have spawned more than 200 infections. But at state-run facilities, there have been fewer than 20 cases. Today, the Victorian Government announced $30 million for 50 of those public sector homes.
To provide upgrades large and small, that's all about creating jobs at a time when they're needed and all about making sure that every resident in public sector aged care gets the very best care.
The number of new cases has more than doubled since yesterday.
We got very excited to see a number like 11 yesterday, and 28 today feels a little bit like heartsink, but we've got to expect that these numbers will fluctuate a little up and down.
But testing rates are up, with more than 11,000 swabs guiding the latest numbers. Strong winds in Melbourne's southeast closed testing sites, including one in Casey, where a recent cluster had authorities on alert.
Actually, there haven't been cases in that cluster for 2 days, which is very reassuring.
Maintaining testing rates and a low rolling average are essential for the promised road out of lockdown. And it appears Victorians are ready to stay the course. A Newspulse survey in July found 61% of people thought the Premier had handled the pandemic well. 36% said badly. Its September poll found the figures have hardly changed. Nicole Asher, ABC News, Melbourne.
Well, border restrictions between South Australia and New South Wales will be eased on Thursday if there are no cases of community transmission in New South Wales before midnight tonight. The change will put an end to the 14-day self-isolation period for those entering South Australia, but anyone who does travel to the state will still need to register online before arriving.
This will be a massive, massive relief to people who have been dislocated from friends, from family, from business opportunities.
Similar restrictions with the ACT were eased last week, meaning people could fly into South Australia from Canberra. Under this latest change, ACT residents would be able to drive through New South Wales to get to South Australia without having to self-isolate. Well, 2 people associated with the Tour de France team have been taken into custody as part of an investigation into doping allegations. It follows a search that uncovered what is described as a method that could be qualified as doping, according to a French prosecutor. Let's get more on the story with the Director of Studies in Sports Law at the University of Melbourne, Jack Anderson. Jack, good to talk to you again. This is devastating news for the Tour. Tell us about the team that's involved.
Well, first of all, the Tour de France was postponed from earlier in the year. It's obviously one of the more iconic events in the European summer, so they were very pleased that they got to the end of it in the COVID and coronavirus pandemic, which, as you've heard earlier, is still quite prevalent in France to a very high degree. So they finished at the weekend with a new young star who was in the yellow jersey, and yet what we've heard today is that last week, various rooms in which a team, Arkana Samsic, were staying, were raided by the authorities. Now, it must be made clear that this seems to be a preliminary investigation. It's not the police, nor is it the doping authorities, the French doping authorities, or the French anti-doping authorities. It's actually a public health investigation. And the public health investigators, exactly as you say, have seemed to uncover a method that you can administer or prescribe performance-enhancing substances. So that's the preliminary investigation. It's also important to note that no riders are involved, nor is the team itself directly involved, but 2 support personnel to 1 rider have been taken into custody.
Give us a better understanding of what this means by a medical procedure that could mean doping. What kinds of examples could that be?
This is the interesting point in terms of the administration and prescription of the substance. So what the authorities haven't given us much idea on what exactly has happened in terms of the assistance. And that is the important point, that the focus is not particularly on a team. It's not particularly on a rider as we know now, but it is on support personnel. And that is fairly typical of the French authorities. In France, doping is to a certain degree criminalized, but it is the supply, sometimes the trafficking of it, which is prohibited. And this historically actually relates back to previous doping scandals that unfortunately have affected.
And that's such a good point that you make, because even this extraordinary superhuman effort that saw a young gun crowned winner of the Tour de France on the final sprint it was questioned, or eyebrows at least were raised, because there's always this nervousness around the Tour when you see a superhuman effort like that.
Yeah, and that is the problem that the Tour has. That is the problem that cycling has, that it is still paying for sins of the past, if you like. So if we go back, see, for example, to 1998, we almost had a Tour abandoned because of doping considerations. And thereafter, we had the World Anti-Doping Agency established. But of course, then in the early 2000s, we had the dominance of Lance Armstrong, something that wasn't really resolved until 2012, and in some ways still hasn't been resolved. And it's exactly the point that every major achievement that you see in the Tour de France, and competing the Tour de France over 3 weeks is a superhuman achievement, is seen as being incredible by certain aspects or certain people who.
But Jack, of course, there are people that I guess have done their time but were involved in doping in the past, still involved in the Tour in some way. Does that always have that sort of air of perhaps this is still going on in a more sophisticated fashion?
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the things that the cycling's governing body, the UCI, is very well aware of. And the UCI was, and it learned painfully from the past, one of the early adopters of some of the more sophisticated scientific techniques. Now, generally in sports, for people who are on the more cynical side of it, they will also always say that the cheats are ahead. But this is a discussion we have. And in some ways, what those involved in the Tour and those involved in sport will say is that this distracts from the core elements of sport. But unfortunately, the modern version of sport, and unfortunately, the modern version of the Tour, is tied up with doping allegations.
Yeah, as you pointed out at the beginning, it was a miracle that the Tour happened at all. But of course, there's been financial disruption to the Tour because of these kind of allegations as well, and just getting the race mid-COVID. What sort of impact could this have on the financial stability of the race?
Yeah, so one of the things with the Tour de France, even though it's a hugely iconic event, and even though cycling is hugely popular, particularly in certain parts of Europe, it's not, if you like, a mainstream sport compared to others such as football, etc. So therefore, the problem with any corruption type allegation, if we look at doping in those senses, is that it has an impact on the brand. It has an impact commercially on the sport itself, and in the numbers of viewers and the coverage that TV companies will pay to give to that sport itself. So that's a key issue, that corruption or anti-doping allegations corrode the brand and corrode the integrity of the sport.
Indeed. Jack, always good to get your insights on this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a day of drama with some sadness and some success. A small number of stranded pilot whales have been saved after getting stuck on sandbars off Tasmania's west coast, but around 100 have already died. Edith Bevan is in Strawn.
In cold Tasmanian waters, rescuers are doing their best. Work to save the stranded whales is slow. About 25 of the 270 have been rescued so far.
This is such a tricky event, such a complex event, that any whale we save, we're considering a real win.
At Ocean Beach, 23 whales have died and 3 are being triaged. At the main site, 2 larger pods have merged, but the whales are more spread out. Around a third of the whales have already died. At Ocean Beach, the task is tough. The couple of whales that are still alive aren't in enough water to refloat. They need to be moved along the beach first to be released further away.
I sort of expected there'd be more alive than there is, but there seems to be a lot of them, not moving. It's a bit disappointing, a bit heartbreaking.
Crews are focusing their efforts in the deep channel where the whales have a better chance of survival. It's a guiding rather than towing process.
The crews have been becoming more proficient and efficient throughout the day, so the effort has speeded up, so we'll continue to do the same tomorrow.
About 65 staff and volunteers are involved with extra help from local fish farms. For rescue teams, the task is both physically and mentally exhausting.
We're dealing with large stressed animals, for several days at a time, and it does take an emotional toll sometimes.
No, it's not the best thing to be looking at, especially when you're here in person and you're not just looking at it from Facebook. It's a lot more confronting.
Rescue crews will use a helicopter and infrared camera technology to properly assess how many of the whales are still alive. They acknowledge they'll only be dealing with live animals for a short period. By the end of the week, the focus is likely to shift from rescue to retrieval and disposal. It's unclear what caused the mass stranding, and authorities say it may never be known. Edith Bevan, ABC News, Strahan.